Morag Fraser, thank you very much for speaking with me this morning. It's an honor to speak with you. You created Eureka Street alongside Michael Kelly and Adrian Lyons. You're one of the initial team, and you went on to edit Eureka Street for 13 years, 1991 to 2003. How did you come to be involved?
Let's be absolutely honest. I didn't create it. It was a group enterprise. I edited it, but very different. How did I get to be involved? Catholic osmosis, I think, David. I don't remember exactly, but in the 80s, I'd been working on an Australian version of The Catholic Worker, the very famous Dorothy Day social justice magazine. And I was working there with Damien Coleridge, who's the brother of now Archbishop Mark Coleridge, and his wife. And I'm not sure that Mick Kelly was around, also my parish priest, Terry Layler, at the time. So Mick would have known, Michael Kelly would have known that I've been working in Catholic journalism. I think I sang at Michael Kelly's diaconate. I was at university with Adrian Lyons, and that all sort of came together somehow. Also, I was living in Canberra. Mick knew I was miserable in Canberra. So he said, come back to Melbourne and work with us. So that's the accident that got me where I got to.
Catholic osmosis, I like that. Eureka Street was a fully formed publication with its own tone, its own identity. I was keen to see that. In March 1991, it gets launched and it looks like it's been around for years. What were the publications that first inspired Eureka Street?
It was more the publications from which we wanted to differentiate ourselves, I think, because all of those men, and they were men, that sat in the background of this were broad thinkers. And I don't think they wanted a Catholic silo magazine. So we looked at everything. We looked at all the examples, like the English Tablet, like the American National Catholic Reporter, like the Jesuits magazine, the name of which has just gone out of my head, America. We looked at all the commercial, the secular magazines too, the ones that were current in Australia at the time. But remember, at the time in Australia too, about 6 small magazines had fallen over at that particular time. So there was a hole to be filled. And we also wanted a magazine that explored, that wasn't, as I said, a silo magazine. It wasn't a specifically theological magazine. So the New Yorker was one of the magazines that I often thought about, because it had that wonderful blend of current affairs and deep thinking. So that was the background, but we didn't want to imitate anything. We wanted an Australian magazine that was edited by Catholics, that came out of a whole Jesuit way of being and a way of thinking. So that was it. It was complicated. And a lot of thought went into the way it would appear when it first came out, and who we would ask to write, because it ended up being very much a team operation over time, with the same writers over time too, so that there was a coherence to it.
I'm interested in knowing more about that specific tone, because that's one thing that does stand out about Eureka Street. It's deep thinking, it's about current affairs, it's theological yet irreverent at the same time. It's quite an interesting blend of tones. Like that's a very kind of unique mix. I'm interested to know kind of how deliberate that was. I mean,
entirely
deliberate. Fantastic.
Entirely deliberate. When I had lunch with the then provincial Peter Steele, who was ironic in every fingernail, bone, and part of his body, before we started publishing, Peter's writing instructions to me, they were very complicated. He said, you've got to publish the best writing you can lay your hands on. That's all he ever said. That was it. Now, I'd been reading Peter since the early 1960s, and I knew what he meant by the best writing you can lay your hands on. Peter himself was ironic. He saw the complexity of the world, I suppose, and that's what the magazine tried to do, which is why we published so many cartoons. we had a brilliant cartoonist. I'm not sure how we got him. I think he came through Ray Kassin from Western Australia. You will have seen Dean Moore's cartoons, which are brutally funny. So I don't mean to be facetious. It was important that we not be worthy, if you know what I mean. It was meant to be both deep thinking and worldly at the same time, and to plug gaps and to keep people, it was a magazine after all, to keep people engaged, entertained. I think the part of the magazine that we competed most to write in were the film reviews. I had theologians, I had professor of philosophy begging, coming and screaming to sort of to get to go and review films. So the tone, it had to be complex. The world's complex.
Wonderful. What great advice as well. Publish the best writing that you can lay your head on.
Yeah.
And for anyone watching who isn't sure of who Peter Steele is, would you be able to give us a brief background of what an influential figure Peter was in the story of Eureka Street?
Yeah. Peter Steele was a Jesuit priest. He was a poet. He was, at the very beginning of Eureka Street, he was the provincial of the Jesuits. He was professor of English in the Melbourne English Department. He was an intellectual powerhouse. He was an extremely unusual, profoundly gifted man. He influenced everyone, I think, that was around for the foundation of Eureka Street, all of the Jesuits themselves, Michael Kelly particularly, Adrian he would have as well. He was ordained at the same time as Andrew Hamilton, who subsequently became one of the publishers of Eureka Street. They would have been competitor Jesuits in their youth. He was just a wonderful man, and a very, very complex man, intellectually formidable, kind, sharp as a tack. He could be brutally ironic. So that was Peter Steele, one of the most astonishing human beings I've ever met.
I'm really keen to hear more about what stands out to you when you recall that time starting Eureka Street, and what were the early challenges of starting a publication?
The challenge was to produce something that would cohere, and not just be a random series of articles. I think that was always the challenge when you're producing a magazine, to produce something which is greater than the sum of its parts.
Still a challenge.
It still is. I think that's the challenge, particularly for a monthly magazine. And I'll say something to you as an editor. Over time, but even from very early on, this sounds a bit mystical and I don't mean it to, but there was a moment in the monthly production process when all of the stuff had come in. Some of the visual material had come in, and the visual material was very important, particularly to me because I'm a visual person. There was a moment in the production process fairly late on where I would feel physically a sort of clunk, as though things had come together. It made a whole. Now, I'm not sure I can anatomize that for you, how all the component parts came, but it had a lot to do with the fact that there was a consistent team of people, writers, production people, people downstairs, everywhere. Everyone sort of got what the feel should be like. And we had a very broad, you can always get writers to write. There's never a problem getting material. We always had much too much. But if you knew who could produce good material at a particular time, and that was sort of part of the zeitgeist somehow, we knew what was going on. If you go back to the very first edition, that was produced, I think there was the cricket was going on and the Gulf War was going on at the same time. And to produce something that could somehow keep those balls in the air at the same time, this is a fairly incoherent answer to a straight question, but it was just putting it together so that it made sense for that month in that year, and it it produced and gave you the voices of people that were thinking hard, not to tell you what to think, but to analyse the issues in ways that daily newspapers can't do. And these days, of course, God knows they don't do at all. So it was that. It was a search for coherence and depth, and bringing together. This was one of the enormous privileges, bringing together a huge variety of talent, because there was. I mean, we were so lucky. We had wonderful sub-editor in Ray Kassin. We had a fantastic production staff. We always did. We had, I think, some of the best documentary photographers in the world. We had fabulous cartoonists. We had theological depth in our writers. We had men and women of social conscience. And they would, and when I say people love to write, they love to be published too. So you can exploit all that and then put it together. But to put it together in a way that made sense for the time, that was the challenge.
There's something in that I think really resonates. The idea that you can always find people to write, but you can't always find the right voices who will definitely speak to the zeitgeist and be able to communicate something to the culture, about the culture in a way that really sort of feels right for the moment. Again, that's incoherent as well, but I think I know what you mean.
You can be lucky. I mean, I think because between Adrian, Michael, Peter, all of the people behind the magazine, we had pretty broad acquaintance, and so there was always someone that you could, you knew someone would know about South Africa when South Africa voted, and we had Mandela on the cover. We had a journalist in Sri Lanka during the Civil War. I had a professor here in Canberra who had lived in New Guinea for a long time. So when Bougainville blew up, Jim was there to write. I'm plucking names out of. Andy Hamilton wrote extensively about immigration right at the time. So we had boat people, and there's intellectual depth in the Jesuits you can always call on too. And so when an encyclical came out, I knew that my canon lawyers were as good as their canon lawyers, and we could publish 4 or 5 articles on a particular encyclical, for which I got a very critical letter from the cathedral telling me that I had published articles critical of an encyclical. And yeah, I had, and I'd do it again, because I believe very firmly that these things are part of Catholic dialogue and Catholic conversation.
Well, it seems like you had a really great team, like a world-class team that were really excited to be a part of it. How did you create that energy, that sort of that excitement for all these best minds from all these different areas to all want to pull together as a team in Eureka Street?
I said before, writers like to be published, so you've only got to ask, and they nearly always will. Unless they're extremely grand, and if they're extremely grand, I probably wasn't interested anyway. But we did have a team. I remember the very first edition, Margaret Simons, who's a terrific journalist. Margaret, just trying to remember exactly. Margaret was writing about water and about water policy and about the Murray-Darling. This is early 1990s. Andy Hamilton I could always rely on to talk about immigration. There were wonderful people that had a depth of sociological knowledge, like Peter Mayers, Peter Brown, who'd gone on to work on Inside Story, that could always be relied on to write about social issues. I had wonderful columnists that would always turn up with the goods. We had a science columnist, Tim Thwaites, who always had something very interesting to say. John Honour used to write fabulously twisty theological columns that were always interesting to read. Michael McGurr, Gerard Windsor, Frank Brennan through Marbo, just knew what to say, knew who to contact. If he wasn't going to write it, he knew who would. So it was just, I suppose the only challenge was not wearing yourself out. I remember never falling asleep in the office, but my children used to tell me, Mum, you've got to stop doing this. I would get to the bottom of my drive. I'm about 20k away from where we were in Eureka Street. And I would stop the car at the bottom of our long drive and I'd fall asleep before I got to get up the rest of the drive. So that was a challenge, just, maintaining the energy and not wearing the staff out. I was always conscious. Feed your staff. There was one night, you talk about challenges, about 7 o'clock, and it was the night before Shane Doran, our wonderful printer who we kept for the entire time. Shane was due at 9 o'clock in the morning to pick up the copy. At 7 o'clock at night, on the large screen, the copy suddenly sort of turned itself into spaghetti and distributed itself entirely across the screen, and we lost the lot. Paul Fife, who was our wonderful, very single-minded tech person, Jesuit priest, Paul sat at the machine and started to sort of try and work out what had happened. I knew we had to get it out the next morning, so we had the proof edition from that morning, and you'll know yourself, between 9 o'clock in the morning and 7 o'clock at night, when you're putting in final proofs, a lot of things happened. So the 4 or 5 of us in the office, my assistant editor Kate Manton, the designer Siobhan Jackson, and our television reviewer Juliette Hughes, who's a fantastically good masseuse, we got all the hard copy proofs. Juliette massaged everyone's back, kept us awake, and at 3 o'clock in the morning we'd put it all together again while Paul was sitting in the machine still working out what had gone wrong. So there were challenges like that too. That's a sort of one of those office incidents answers to a question that you didn't ask, but there were moments, I hope it never happens to you. Just watching it disappear like little bits of black spaghetti. It just went away. When Shane arrived the next morning, nothing had happened. There was the edition, and he could take it off. Oh God!
Absolute nightmare. Oh God.
Yeah.
Well, despite setbacks like that,
that was fun. It was all part of it. Kept the food coming, the massages, the production staff. My various sub-editors over time, and Ray Kassin and Kate Manton, I'm thinking of particularly, and John Greenaway, they were just fantastic. They were fine details and fine intellectual details. Kate was an absolute demon for consistency. So they were terrific. I was very lucky in that regard. I think Eureka Street was very lucky in that regard because it kept the production values high, which is another way that you keep your writers. If you're not going to muck with their copy, and if what they send you after you've edited it, Jack Waterford used to send me double the length and usually late. And he's never once in 13 years did he ever say to me, "You've done something awful with my copy," when I'd taken 800 words out of it, or Ray had taken 800 words out of it. So, but we knew what his mindset was, and so we could edit to him. And also he wrote very fast. He's an automatic writer, so you could cut him with impunity. Peter Steele, I don't think I ever dared to cut a word out of. Some poet, no, I won't start. That's enough.
So it seems that there's a lot that depends on the quality of the team, and seems like there was a really good team around you at the time. How do you find people like Ray Kassin at the time? It's like it seems like that was a really good fit.
Oh, more Catholic osmosis. If I say Mick met him in a bar, that could be true. Look, I don't remember. No, it's even more osmotic than that. Ray did a stint in the Dominicans, I think, in Perth, when Bill Uren was probably Bill Uren Jesuit Provincial then, when Bill was over there as rector. So Ray would have known Bill, who then would have told Mick, and then Ray came, and I think he was working at The Age at the time, which Margaret Simons was also doing. So all those sorts of connections. You just, if you make a connection, you make use of it.
Amazing.
Yeah. Yes, it was. I'll say one thing though too, David, and I wish this would be true for you. Those days have gone. With newspapers, those days have gone too. And the foment that you get in a newsroom, or that you get in an office that's got maybe 30 people in it at any given time, because Eureka Street wasn't the only production coming out of that street, on that building on Victoria Street. Australian Catholics was coming out downstairs. Madonna, David Lovell, lovely publisher, would walk through every day. So there was a lot of just loose expertise around too. And if a proofreader for something couldn't come in one day, the proofreader for something else could. So there was a lot of feed in. And I know there are pleasures and privileges about working from home, but I couldn't have done that without working together, because what happened over morning tea at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, or what happened over dinner through those last 2 or 3 production days, often was the crucial thing that just fixed a problem, or put in a graphic that worked, or had an idea for the cover, or a headline. Ray Kassin, incidentally, was the best headliner I've ever met, and I've met a few. No wonder we won Walkleys for the headlines. They were just, when you talk about wit or the tone, it had a lot. It was very irreverent, and it was irreverent in the way that acknowledges the dignity of things in a way too, if you know what I mean. It wasn't satire. It was, yeah.
And I think that balance really comes through throughout the publication, that it does seem to have this driving care of human dignity, and all the while still it's somehow not taking itself too seriously, while taking itself very seriously. It seems like an incredibly fine line to tread.
It is a fine line. You take your material seriously, you don't take yourself seriously at all. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, if I just back to Peter Steele, who hovers over this like a guardian angel for me, he'd hate that. Peter's one of the funniest people I've ever met. Some of the poems are the funniest poems I've ever read. And other ones take you to the heart of hell. Yeah. What I was going to say then, to do with the breadth, but also treating people with dignity and respect, there was an ecumenical aspect to it as well, which is why we had wonderful writing from people from different denominations, from friends of mine that are Jewish, or not even friends of mine, people that were atheists. If you took their ideas and what they could write seriously, then I don't think they regarded it as a Catholic publication, which wouldn't be the right place for them, put it that way.
Was that groundbreaking at the time?
I'm always wary of words like groundbreaking. It was unusual. I think it was unusual for people looking at us rather than for us, because they'd say, this is a magazine of theology. Doesn't the cathedral tell you what to write? And you'd think, try. No, look, good writing's always open to ideas. It doesn't have to be Catholic. And it was an exercise in journalism. And if you look at the codes of ethics for journalists, they were what we followed rather than any theological dictates, but there was a depth to it, intellectual integrity and wit and seriousness and an understanding of your audience and a love of people. Works. It's just a good formula.